It's almost impossible for me to follow that. It reminds me of something Oscar Wilde said, which is that your lifestyle, how you lead your life, is actually a work of art of your own creation over which you should have rights. And it's peculiar that we aren't more bothered than we are. And it fascinates me psychologically. And one of the reasons I realise this isn't a very easy problem to solve is simply watching American programs, whether it may be Criminal Minds or CSI or 24, where it is routinely shown that government employees have, to be honest, fancifully good access to real-time data about people. Those of you who watch Criminal Minds will know it only too well. And yet, it seems to me that the populace watching this find this reassuring rather than frightening. And that strikes me as a psychological problem we'll have to overcome before you can get people suitably exercised about this area, because it is genuinely important. Because I think it's quite right that actually you are the product without realizing it. What I'm going to talk about is a slightly different angle, which is another technology that bothers me, which is much, much older, more pervasive, and written about far, far less, which is the spreadsheet. Nobody regards the spreadsheet as particularly dangerous. I do, in fact, because what it seems to do is it makes it extraordinarily easy to compare and optimize things. The only exception, the only caveat being that those things, whatever they be, that are input into a spreadsheet effectively have to be numerically expressible. And actually, everything from big data to mathematical modelling. I don't know how many people are familiar here with Daniel Kahneman's idea of the brain with System 1 and System 2. System 1 being largely instinctive, automatic, working on heuristics and so forth. System 2 being, depending on who you are, to be honest, some people would say it's, you know, this poor little beleaguered sense of reason and logic that's fighting back against the insane instincts of System 1. I would argue, but then I would, working in advertising, that actually System 1 does a spectacularly good job most of the time, and we happen to have as humans a slightly inadequate electronic calculator that's sellotaped to our foreheads, which occasionally is useful, but isn't all that great. I mean, just to give you an example, in terms of human perception, our brain takes in 11 megabits of data every second, of which I think System 2, conscious reason, can process about 60 bits per second. So there's a hell of a lot going on somewhere else. Much of it, actually, we're not even consciously aware of. My other concern is that we're actually creating, without being fully aware of it, a System 3, which is where computers... Is that a very strange popping noise? Do I need a spoffle? Is that all right? The audio is fine. Okay. We're creating a kind of System 3, which is where we actually happily delegate decision-making to computers, which will come up with reasons which at least seem plausible to begin with and may even be empirically rather good. But at some point, the causes of those reasons, the actual background logic of that decision, may be entirely opaque to us. I'll give you a few interesting stories which perhaps you won't want to hear. In cases of employment, for example, in call centres, but also when employing coders, one of the things they do is they set a questionnaire for everybody to fill in when they apply for a job. And then over time, it's a kind of ongoing study, they look at what are the elements that people fill in, what elements of an application seem to be predictive of success in the workplace. Some rather strange and terrifying things emerge from this, by the way, which is that, I shouldn't really say this, should I? But the quality of your educational grade, the quality of your degree, has no predictive value whatsoever. Okay. Which does raise some important questions. I don't know how many people are familiar with the signalling theory of education, that it's purely there as a means of signalling both intelligence and commitment, and your ability, I imagine, to resist to some degree the temptations of sex and drugs, and therefore to be able to defer gratification. But that actually what you're actually taught is less important than actually the use of education as a kind of winnowing device for people to hire. Okay? But certainly it is alarming to know that in many jobs that educational the grade of your degree seems to have no predictive value. Which, by the way, it particularly disturbs me. One of the most extraordinarily over-tweeted articles I've ever written was one in the Spectator, which was entitled, "Why I'm Hiring Graduates with Thirds This Year," which was widely misunderstood, by the way. I wasn't saying that people with thirds are quite possibly better than people with firsts, although that's debatable, by the way. Certainly if you wanted to actually have a connection with educational attainment and material wealth, probably being a Harvard dropout would actually be, since Bill Gates and Zuckerberg probably make up about a fairly large chunk of that 1% we see, and they're both Harvard dropouts, they alone will distort the figures quite markedly, I think. But also, there are some quite strange things which do have predictive value over how valuable you'll be as an employee. And one of the most predictive things is apparently whether you fill in that application form online using a Chrome browser, a Firefox browser, or Internet Explorer. And it seemed to be that the best employees generally, in this one individual case, had used either Firefox or Chrome. That had predictive value, educational attainment didn't. Okay? It reminds me, by the way, of a similar experiment which shows that on dating sites, it is equally efficient to increase your desirability of the opposite sex as a woman, either to gain a college degree or to dye your hair blonde. I might point out that in the age of non-free education, that the second is considerably less expensive than the first. Another example of gaming the system, by the way, which I think is rather elegant, is simply quite a few people have sussed out in the United States that getting into an Ivy League university carries about 90% of the value in terms of your starting salary, if you can put it on your CV. I was accepted to Harvard. Carries about 90% of the value of actually having a Harvard degree. And since actually getting accepted to Harvard costs about 1% of the cost of completing a Harvard degree, some rather smart people have actually realized you can game the system by simply getting accepted to Harvard and then concocting a very good reason as to why you turned it down, therefore saving yourself perhaps 3 years of signaling. But there's something a little disturbing about this, which is, okay, in this case, we know that the browser is the variable that seems to have some predictive value. You might argue this is not really fair. You know, somebody might have applied from their dad's house, for example, using a completely different browser. Can you really write back to someone and say, I'm terribly sorry, but your application has been unsuccessful because unfortunately you used the wrong kind of browser software in which to complete it? Similarly, what happens when you develop more complex algorithms where nobody has the slightest idea what's actually going on? Where you accept people and reject people, literally, computer says no, simply because no human being on the planet fully understands why the computer said no. And that frightens me about big data. That actually, first of all, there are a few things we ought to be concerned about. It is perfectly possible for big data to be dangerously wrong. There are all manner of things which 99% of people don't understand. You know, what is the effect of confounding variables here, for example, or how do we correct for heteroscedasticity? Okay, now does anybody know what? There are probably 2 people in the room who actually know vaguely how to correct for heteroscedasticity, and yet business people and people in governmental positions are very, very happy to outsource decisions to what I might call System 3, some sort of mathematical model. Why is that? We're always very happy to outsource decisions to anything, whether it's a mathematical model or indeed a kind of bureaucracy, or a code of conduct, for the simple reason that individually it absolves us from responsibility for the decision. IBM had a very good slogan, which was "No one ever got fired for buying IBM," which probably understood the psychology of loss aversion and the psychology of business decision-making better than any other sentence ever written. It's simply that if you think of the outcome of any kind of decision in business or politics, it's deeply asymmetric in its outcome. If you make a good decision, someone might actually say, well done, or that was pretty good. Okay? If you make a bad decision, you can lose your job. Therefore, it prompts people very heavily, first of all, towards what's called defensive decision-making. Decision-making that may be pretty good, it's probably all right. It probably isn't optimal, but it's one that's very unlikely to have adverse consequences. Okay? It also leads people, wherever possible, to offload the responsibility for the decision on someone else. By the way, a human cognitive bias that very largely explains the existence of management consulting, in my opinion. Slightly controversial, I accept. And defensive thinking exists everywhere. And computers will make defensive thinking just easier? Well, we had a model, and this option was 1.7 and the other one was 1.3, so we obviously went with a higher number. Doesn't mean it's a good decision. It means it's a decision that's easy to defend or for which you can't get fired, and they're not the same thing. What you're also doing by doing that, by the way, is system one, the instinctive lizardy part of our brain, is, to give it its due, the product of quite a few million years of evolution, and may actually have some intelligence there that we ourselves don't understand. There's a wonderful phrase, I think, in evolutionary psychology, that evolution is cleverer than all of us. There are things that apparently make no sense, but which, by surviving for rather a long time, probably have some value. That's as much as you can say. Okay? You know, it's very interesting. The human appendix was, for example, long regarded as this peculiar evolutionary thing, a sort of hangover that was no longer necessary but had once served a function. They only discovered the function, I think, about 5 to 10 years ago, which is that after you've had a very bad bout of diarrhea, the microflora that actually perform your, most of your digestion actually effectively repopulate your gut from forming a little besieged group of hostages in the appendix. They then actually survive long enough there to actually then spread back into your gut after the hideous illness has passed. But system one patently has some talents. Now let's take a look at, for example, this excessive use of computation in what used to be the friendly neighbourhood bank manager. And I've long believed this. I didn't have the courage to say it until I read an interesting book by, which I've briefly forgotten the title of, but I'll remind you of later, where someone said the same thing. Previously, the job of a bank manager, he was responsible both for loans. He had to make some loans, otherwise he was insanely cautious, you know. But he was also responsible for the losses. And therefore, he was an extraordinarily cautious lender who would use all manner of information, I would argue probably excessively, in most of the case, to resist lending to people who seemed the slightest bit risky. You know, if you're a bit flash, or even worse, you're married to someone who is extravagant, or if you are a known drunkard or whatever, you would find it difficult to get a loan. What this was replaced with was effectively a mathematical model. So the responsibility for a bad loan then sits with the model, and the only responsibility for a bank manager is effectively now to lend as much as possible within the constraints of that particular model. So he has suddenly gone from being a human decision maker who sits on the ground with some purpose. He's responsible both for, you know, lending enough money to actually make a reasonable return, but at the same time also responsible for the bad decisions he makes. Now he's offloaded the bad side to some computerized credit scoring model, and his simple excuse is to basically, his job is, within the constraints of those rules, to lend as much money as he possibly can. By the way, what pretty quickly happens is people work out ways to game the system as well. When you charge them effectively, when in effect they suddenly have a very asymmetric incentive, that in other words they can capitalize on gains but they're not really held responsible for losses, the whole game fundamentally changes. And that extent that we're actually outsourcing things to what you might call system 3 is something we need to be a bit alert to. You know, because we have a natural tendency towards defensive thinking. If I can find any convenient, plausible model that will effectively justify my decision so it can seem to be as little to do with me personally as possible, then I will jump at that. And funnily enough, I discovered it. Gerd Gigerenzer, who's a wonderful person to read at the Max Planck Institute, he writes about it in really serious terms about doctors and the extent to which they practice and recommend suboptimal treatment simply because it's the one that's least likely to get them into trouble. I work in the advertising industry, and I discovered defensive thinking in a completely different place, which is much more trivial, but equally interesting, which is simply business passengers for British Airways. British Airways operates, you may not know about it, 2 flights a day to and from London City Airport to New York, to JFK. They're business class only flights. There are about 32 seats on an Airbus 317, I think it is. It's a pretty fantastic service, not least because London City Airport is tiny. And you can turn up 20 minutes before the flight leaves. Boarding the plane takes about a minute and a half because there are only about 26 of you. And you just go, oh, we'll board now, shall we? Oh, right, we're all sitting down, let's take off. Rather than waiting for 350 other people to play Tetris with the overhead luggage lockers for about 20 minutes. And it kind of, I asked the weird question, and you know, It's often assumed that advertising is all about persuading people to buy things they don't need. Quite a lot of the time, advertising is asking why the hell people don't want things that they do need. Okay? And moist lavatory paper is another example. Okay? Why does nobody buy it? If there's anybody Japanese here, you're excused because you have a lavatory that actually cleans your bum automatically with a jet of water. My argument is no one will go out into the garden potting a plant, get a bit of mud on their hands, come back into the house and go, oh dear, my hands are muddy. I must clearly rub them vigorously with some dry paper to get them clean. You'd use water, right? So why is it that the single part of your body that most needs to be clean, for reasons of general hygiene and everything else, is the only part of your body you attempt to clean with dry paper? I do have an answer, but I don't have time or possible explanation. It's partly just due to the ratio of the goods on the shelves. Dry lavatory paper is very big, there are lots of brands of it, and it comes in lots of different sizes. Therefore, it occupies about 95% of the visible space on a supermarket shelf in the lavatory paper section. Moist lavatory paper is very small, there are only 2 brands and only one size, so the human brain instinctively goes, well, clearly not very many people buy that, it's probably for weirdos with a medical condition or something. So I'll just default to the norm. But with this example of British Airways of defensive thinking, it was simply, why isn't there a queue? Why isn't there actually a waiting list to board this plane? It's a pretty good thing. Anybody who lives east of, well, to be honest, east of the West End, London City is much quicker to get to than Heathrow. Anybody who lives in Kent, Essex, even East Sussex, will generally find that easier. Why isn't there a queue? There are only 2 flights a day, only 32 seats. You'd think the thing would be oversubscribed, and yet it isn't. And then we realised what was going on. It's a business class only flight. In every single business class booking, generally 2 intermediaries are involved. There's your assistant or secretary or someone similar or a company travel booker, and there's a corporate travel agent. Both of those people instinctively adopt defensive thinking, which is, whatever I do, never do anything that might get me shouted at. Okay? And we suddenly realize you book the person just as you always have, using the default solution out of Heathrow, okay? If something then goes wrong, the flight's delayed, you've done nothing particularly eccentric or unusual, so that's British Airways' fault. If you do the innovative, different thing and book them out of London City, and the flight's delayed, that's your fault. Well, this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't shown any initiative and booked me out of this weird airport. Similarly, if you book someone from Berkshire, let's say, out of London City, they shout at you. If you book someone from Essex out of Heathrow, they go, well, that's probably the only place there's a flight from. Nobody shouts at you. So the defensive thinking drives you towards that default. Anything you can do to effectively offload any decision being pinned on you, and we will use any tool, whether it's a bureaucracy or whether it's a model, a mathematical model, to effectively to offload or outsource responsibility for our actions. A very small group of people don't. Entrepreneurs, owners of companies generally don't do that. They actually make decisions effectively, which wonderfully they don't have to justify to anybody else. Nearly everybody else in any corporate environment has to create a decision which is not only good, has to be tolerable perhaps, but one which is easy to defend. And the thing that most worries me, therefore, as a product of this, is the standard model of classical economics, which I think has become, by the way, I work in advertising. I'm certainly not hostile to free markets or anything of that kind, but it strikes me that it has become far too pervasive simply because it is the only model of human behaviour, because it only really cares about cost-benefit, which is therefore conveniently numerically expressible, mathematically expressible. Why is that a problem? Well, until about 6 months ago, the only thing that I had as a beef with neoclassical microeconomic models of human behaviour were that they were kind of wrong, that it was obvious that behavioural economics, that evolutionary psychology had much more nuanced and interesting explanations for why we did what we did, which had far more predictive value than neoclassical economics. So it just annoyed me that this simplification was so powerful. It also annoyed me, to be honest, because if you work in marketing or advertising, one of the things you've got to realise is that classical economic thinking, neoclassical economic thinking, is very pervasive in business schools. It's very, very pervasive in finance, in banking. And it's particularly irksome to me because, of course, if people have studied this, their fantasy world of human interaction exists in this bizarre imaginary parallel universe where a series of individual economic actors engage in a series of anonymous standalone transactions in order to maximize their constant transitive utility, preferences, in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. Okay? Now, the reason that particularly bothers me is if you ever had any environment where you had perfect information and perfect trust, you wouldn't need marketing and advertising at all. I freely admit I'd be out of a job. The fortunate thing for me is that that situation exists somewhere between very rarely and never, and probably closer to never, to be absolutely honest. But these assumptions simply bother me because they were wrong and because they were a bit unkind to marketing and advertising and psychology in the way they modelled the world. But then a more frightening thing occurred to me, which is that actually what happens if occasionally the real world increasingly comes to resemble the map. In other words, that actually economic assumptions and models actually make the world a bit more like the dismal, soulless world, devoid of psychology, ethics, trust. Lots and lots of abstract nouns are all missing from this. And actually, the world becomes more like economics simply because of the prevalence of the model. So let's try a little thought experiment here. Let's imagine you have a sat-nav. Now, I don't know how many people use sat-nav or have used them. But they're generally extraordinarily good. They're one of the miracle technologies. But they are a bit odd sometimes in that they seem to have very peculiar notions about the relative status of a few roads. So if you have a road that's actually quite a good road, which for some reason or other has been downrated to a B road, even though it remains a dual carriageway or a fast two-lane road, it has an extraordinary aversion to directing you down that road because it just sees it as though it were a country lane. And if you have, for example, occasionally, it seems your sat-nav will seem absolutely convinced that the only correct way to do this is to drive across a field. Okay. Well, over time, what will happen if you're not careful is that the reality, it will take time, but the reality will start to resemble the peculiar ideas of the sat-nav. So if it deems a road very unimportant, then fewer and fewer people will be directed down it, fewer people will use it, and eventually the council will say, well, nobody uses this road, people very rarely close roads, but we won't bother to maintain it, or, we'll downgrade it still further. And the strange sort of single farm track suddenly becomes insanely busy, and eventually the decision is made, well, clearly there's massive demand to travel between these 2 points, so we must now build a big fast road down here, just as the model has told people to do. And that possibility seems to exist in terms of a malign influence of economics. And economics has its malign influence simply because it gains a completely ridiculous credibility because it presents its information in mathematical form. And people who aren't very good mathematicians have an instinctive assumption, partly defensive thinking, but partly just to say, well, it's maths, so it must be scientific. There are some numbers here, so clearly we must bow down in reverence to the superior knowledge contained within these numbers. And that genuinely concerns me, because if you think about it, economics is extraordinarily strong at understanding business in terms of efficiency, but it is incredibly weak at understanding system one things, actually, like trust or reputation. And so what it seems to be doing is building businesses which gain the approval of investors and analysts by being extraordinarily efficient, but which are actually increasingly untrustworthy. The ethical dimension and the reputational dimension is actually becoming atrophied, rather like that road that now nobody drives on. Whereas roads that, have some importance, I'm not denying efficiency has an importance, are now becoming, those muscles are effectively becoming overdeveloped. And that seems to me just a little bit alarming. And so the extent to which actually, tragically, the real world can come to resemble the map strikes me as something frightening whenever we do anything where the first requirement of looking credible is to develop some sort of mathematical model. And the simple reason is there aren't SI units for mistrust, there aren't SI units for reputation, there aren't SI units for all manner of really, really important things which make business and commerce possible in the first place. those things also don't behave in simple, linear, modelable ways. There's a wonderful proverb, I think, from the Caribbean, which says, trust grows at the speed of a coconut tree, but falls at the speed of a coconut. That, you know, a brand reputation can take 25 years to build, but can be destroyed with just a couple of bad decisions, more or less in the space of a couple of weeks. These things are not symmetrical, they're not simple quantitative things. So having talked about that, I think it's about time I got a bit more optimistic. And this, by the way, is my favourite model and said that I'm perfectly content with technology so far, provided our progress in psychology keeps pace with it. And I think one of the most important things is there are a few things which nobody understands. It's very, very difficult for us to understand, partly because our own views of our own decision-making are deeply strange. This is Jonathan Haidt's model of the human brain, the rider on the elephant. The elephant is kind of akin to the system one, the instinctive automatic part. The rider is kind of, reason, conscious reason. To be honest, 98%, 99% of all decisions are taken by the elephant, often with virtually no input from conscious reason. And by the way, in many, many cases, it's wonderful that this is so. For example, system one is definitely the system you want to use for emergency braking, for example. I don't think you want to have an inner debate or platonic dialogue in your head when the car in front just stops really, really suddenly. System one has actually kept us alive rather well. I would be dead without system one. I couldn't even survive, but it saved my life on about 5 occasions, by the way. Well, probably many more. So dissing system one is dubious. The other thing to remember is this isn't the sort of dualist Platonic model where reason is pure and wonderful. The rider, the conscious brain, is sometimes capable of interesting mathematical calculations and reasoning, but it's also a bit of a bullshitter. One of its great self-delusions is it thinks it's the Oval Office, when in reality it's mostly the press office. Most of the time it isn't actually issuing directives, it's kind of Alistair Campbell of the brain, hastily cobbling together post-rationalized, plausible-sounding explanations for decisions that have already been taken somewhere else. Okay? So understanding that actually both parts are flawed is a really, really important step forward. System one probably occasionally deploys heuristics in the wrong place and so forth. By the way, any computational system, other than perhaps the mind of God, will be subject to illusions and biases. So I don't know, I'll show you a case of, interestingly, of pareidolia. Do people know that? Our tendency to see faces where there aren't any? Okay, well, interestingly, facial recognition software is also guilty of the same thing. Because you have to calibrate it at some level, and if you calibrate it at the level where it never detects a face when there isn't one, it's appalling at detecting faces when there is one. So the idea, by the way, that cognitive biases are something the brain has but computers don't have is fundamentally wrong. Let me just skip on very quickly. The thing that really bothers me, very simply, how long have we got? About 10 minutes? We, business and government policymakers, tend to see the world through what I call the two lenses of the broken binoculars. Neoclassical economic assumptions being one, another one often being conventional market research. What you're doing there in conventional market research is you're talking to the rider. Daniel Kahneman said advertising is a system one business. In many cases, to be honest, one of the most significant things about the relationship between rider and elephant is the rider can't ultimately get the elephant to do something it instinctively doesn't want to do. There is no way I can use reason any more than I can change your political allegiance through argument, or indeed the football team you support. Has anybody ever been present at a drunken evening where someone goes, yes, you're actually right, I'll change my allegiance. I've been wrong to support Manchester City all these years, and I clearly see through your superior power of reason. I can't imagine what took me so long to realise this. It simply doesn't happen, okay? And in many cases, behavioural change is the one vital thing about the elephant. It's a bit of a herd creature. It tends to be comfortable copying other people. It's a bit of a habitual creature. It likes doing what it did last time. Perfectly good evolutionary reasons for both these tendencies, by the way. It also can't really talk. It can trumpet a bit. By contrast, the rider's a bit of a bullshitter. So when you're talking to people, you're actually talking to the rider. What we often need to be doing, if you want to change behaviour, and if you want to exactly design for experience, the experience is mostly in the mind of the elephant. Okay? And quite a lot of the time we're writing software for the wrong operating system. When we try and change people's behaviours, we're talking to the rider when we need to be designing for the elephant. It's a hugely important thing to understand in all kind of behavioural change programs. And my one optimistic thing is I see the behavioural data that can be gathered on the web as kind of the Galapagos Islands for finally understanding the elephant a bit better. Because the one thing about the data on the web, and I know this does involve loss of privacy to some degree, is it does record what people do, which is much more reliable and interesting than what people say. And some of the things you learn from online behaviour are fascinating. Tiny things can have huge effects. I haven't got time to describe this in full. Simply adding a third button to the checkout process of a large American e-tailer, added, at a cost of about $30,000, added $300 million in sales. What was going on there is it previously had sign in or register, okay? If you're a previous customer, you signed in. If you're a new customer, you registered. A lot of people seemed to drop out at that point and they noticed it. They created a third button that just said continue. And it said, you don't have to register with us to buy from us, but we'll give you a chance to save your details later. Now that was fascinating because what was really interesting was not just that another $300 million in sales was created, and actually 90% of the people who previously dropped out were happy to click that continue button. What was really strange about it was that of those people who clicked the continue button, something like 85 to 90% were perfectly happy to register their details after the purchase had been made. Now that defies both anything you'll learn in market research and anything you'll learn in neoclassical economics. The extraordinary path dependency of human behaviour, which is really, really interesting. It fascinates me. Now, why do I think that's important? Well, it's partly important, obviously, if you can make $300 million by adding a button. That's pretty cool, okay? And that's every year and so forth. But I presented this and someone came to me and they'd spent the late 80s working in New Orleans with HIV positive patients. And they had a massive problem because people would come in and say, I need to have an HIV test. And they'd say, certainly, name please. And they'd suddenly say, I don't need to have a test anymore. Okay? And they'd disappear. Then they discovered something fascinating. You gave these people simply an anonymous number. You tested them. They had to come back with their number to find the test results. Once you had told them their test results, and it did not matter whether the result was positive or negative, both parties were perfectly happy then at that point to leave their data. Now, what I'm saying is there's nothing in those two lenses, those two pairs of binoculars, that ever would have taught us that. It's only something we can learn. The elephant we can only really understand, not by talking to it, because it doesn't talk, but by observation. And I think the possibility to actually treat the online world as a kind of, actually not just for better online design, not just for better digital design of experiences, but to take it into the real world, I think is huge. Changing the choice architecture, by the way, of British Airways' website has a huge effect on sales. I can't tell you how it does, but you can literally, by tweaking the way in which choices are presented, and sometimes the order in which choices are made, can have absolutely enormous effects on what class of travel people actually choose, for example. The software loading bar. Now this fascinates me because if you click on something and there's something moving, okay, we'll happily wait for 3 or 4 minutes because it's loading. Click on a link and nothing happens. After about 3 seconds we go, screw this for a game of soldiers. I'm off to look at pictures of skateboarding kittens, okay? Now, my contention is nobody tells you this, but I think that learning this can actually improve the design of the real world. My great suggestion, if you want people to finish antibiotics, say, any course of medical treatment, don't give them 26 white pills. Give them 18 white or 20 white pills and 6 blue ones, and simply say, when you finish the white pills, take the blue ones. The presence of some sort of milestone. Now, this was a pure assertion of mine when I first made it. Someone at Harvard's actually done the testing. Color coding of pills makes a huge difference. Because if there is some sort of... Now, Disney understands this, by the way. If there's one brilliant company this, Disney's psychology of queuing. They place little 3 minutes to go, 2 minutes to go, 1 minute to go signs in the queue. If you feel you're making some marked progress, likewise waiting on a call center script. You know, it's totally different if they say, you are now 7th in the queue, you are now 3rd in the queue. It's a totally different reaction. The single best thing, by the way, we just instinctively, our inner elephant, or monkey, be perhaps more accurate in Darwinian terms, just hates uncertainty, okay? We really hate it. Now, okay, bearing in mind this thing, that we just like it when it says you're third in the queue, you're second. The single best thing the London Underground did in terms of passenger experience improvement per pound spent wasn't faster, more frequent trains, it was dot matrix display boards on the platform. We'd rather wait 9 minutes for a train knowing it's 9 minutes than wait 5 minutes for a train in a state of uncertainty and funk. Okay? Now, once you know that, suddenly you, I think, can redesign the world. Now, this is the experiment I want to perform over the next year. You're the first people to hear of it, actually, which is men, particularly, are very reluctant to have tests for any kind of medical condition. In fact, we won't go to the doctor unless you put a gun to our head, basically, unless we're really, really ill. Now, I've got a thought experiment here, which is that nobody, outside perhaps the online sphere, has ever tested getting people to do something by saying, do this and we'll tell you the result really quickly. In other words, we will minimize the period during which you're in a state of uncertainty. The one group of people who have are credit card people who find it very successful. They put up a banner and it says, apply now and you can be approved within 1 hour. People go, yeah, I'll apply. Now, neoclassical economics just regards that as bonkers. Okay? Evolutionary psychology probably wouldn't. Evolutionary psychology would say we hate being in a state of uncertainty because what our brain really needs is enough information to make a decision now. And we really hate being in that situation where we can't make a decision now because we're in the not enough information phase. I mean, one of the bits of advice to British Airways was I said, whatever you put on your departure boards, I said, never just put delayed. You're just creating misery for everybody, you know, everybody on the flight. I said, make it exaggerated. Put delayed 60 minutes when it's actually probably going to be 43. That is better than saying just delayed. If I know it's going to be delayed about 60 minutes, I can make a phone call, go and have a meal, you know, get my laptop out. There are loads of other things I can do. I'm now content. I can phone people and say I'm going to be 40 minutes late. If you just put up delayed, you know, I mean, there's some evidence, by the way, people would actually rather be told by their doctor, yeah, you've got a serious illness, than be told there's a 50% chance you've got a serious illness, come back in 3 weeks' time and we'll do some more tests. In terms of your general mental well-being and happiness. Now, understanding this stuff, I think, can be absolutely huge. I think it is in some ways. I was very taken, by the way, with your mention that hobbyists never design for the mass, you know, that they design for each other. And it's an oft-forgotten fact, by the way, that although Tim Berners-Lee, praise be upon him, was initially furious when the World Wide Web, I think it was Mosaic, gave the web browser the possibility of displaying pictures. He thought it was a waste of bandwidth. Just an example of how enthusiasts actually, the very people who have the capability of solving the problem, don't see it as a problem in many cases. Why? Because they're very good at overcoming the problems and actually probably secretly enjoy doing so because it makes them feel clever. Okay? Now this is my little, how long have we got? Literally 3 minutes, roughly? Yeah, okay. If you can look at this sweet spot, what technology now enables you to do, an insight from psychology that makes sense, and something that also makes economic sense, somewhere in that sweet spot, I think you can find something interesting. This is where basically economics is a vicious con. Okay? In that this is how science should work. Physics sits on maths, chemistry sits on physics, biology sits on chemistry, psychology sits on biology, and economics, with the words of Charlie Munger, when someone mentioned behavioural economics to Charlie Munger, he said, well, if economics isn't behavioural, I don't know what the hell is, which I think is a fair point. Okay? Now, what economics has done, in order to make it look mathematically cute, okay, and to gain extraordinary credibility and influence, it basically pretends that it sits here. It strips away everything that makes us human and just says, no, we basically, you know, it's rather like that wonderful thing of, you know, physicists who claim they cracked horse racing. You've all heard this joke, have you? They effectively, a whole load of university departments have their funding cut, and they get all the science faculties together and say, well, there shouldn't be a real problem with our budget cut, because all we need to do, we're the most brilliant scientific minds of a generation, we just need to basically crack horse racing. We'll take our budget, place it on a, you know, surefire outsider, and we'll make up our shortfall just through that. So they all come back after a few weeks, and the chemist saying, no, there's some sort of hormonal thing, but we can't really make any sense of it. We've tried, no, we haven't got anywhere. And the biologists come back and say, clearly genetics and inheritance play a kind of role, but we haven't been able to actually get any predictive data out of this at all. And the physicists say, no, we've cracked it completely. We understand horse racing absolutely. What? How do you do that? They said, well, first you assume that every horse is a perfect sphere and the race takes place in a vacuum, okay? So this is the slight problem that we have to watch. And genuinely, I think computers are making this worse. I'll skip some of this, actually, for reasons. The other vital thing, by the way, to remember is that a huge amount of effort when computers and businesses optimize and measure things, what they're doing is they're improving objective reality. But here's Robert Trivers. It's not in our evolutionary interest to perceive objectively at all. So in many cases, people are actually taking some metric and trying to improve it, which may have no correlation at all with human perception, contentment, or happiness. Most brilliant, I gave this talk and a Portuguese guy came up to me and said, I work for an insurance company, and they were going to spend £300,000 increasing the speed with which they paid out claims, because a lot of their call centre was being bombarded with people ringing up saying, your claim check's taking too long. And they're going to lose a bit of cash flow, send out the checks faster, £300,000 to upgrade operations. And he said, you're completely wrong. He said, there's no such thing in the human brain as fast or slow. He said, there's faster than you expect and slower than you expect. How long does it take you to send out a claim check? They said, 8 days. He said, right. Every time on the phone you agree to pay a claims check, just tell the people, expect your check in 14 days. The checks continued, arriving in 8. All the phone calls of complaint disappeared, and instead they actually received a small trickle of phone calls from people saying, thank you for sending my check so quickly. You don't need to change the reality if you can change the mental frame. But this is Trivers, and it's vital. Okay? It's not in our evolutionary interest to have eyes that are like light meters and ears that are like recording equipment. Massive amounts of data compression, data dumping, error correction go on in the head. Huge amounts of information never even reaches our consciousness at all. By the way, some sounds reach our brain a tenth of a second before we're consciously aware of them, because they take a faster path that just say, be frightened, sudden noise, be frightened, pump out adrenaline. That reaches the brain a tenth of a second quicker because it doesn't have to be processed into what the hell was that noise. That's why when you're in a restaurant and someone drops a load of plates behind you, you jump and then calm down again. Because basically you go, shit, I'm being attacked by a lion. Oh no, it's only some plates. Weirder still, parts of our brain, actually, the vision is processed both ventrally and dorsally. Parts of our brain can actually see things that it can't see. There are people who've had a peculiar brain damage who are completely blind in that they cannot read or see, but if you throw a ball at their head, well, no, you wouldn't do that, it's cruel, but if you threw a rolled up paper ball at their head, they'd automatically swat it away, and they can walk down a corridor avoiding obstacles. The parts of the brain, the reason that part of the brain exists is simply because it's a tenth of a second faster than the bit that actually makes sense of the world. It's the most peculiar thing. But the idea that it's called Psychophysics. If you're really interested in this, read books by Mark Changizi, who is the guru of this whole field. Extraordinary stuff. A and B, two squares marked A and B. A is darker than B, you all agree. Actually, if I change the context, they are, to a light meter, they're exactly the same colour. It's not one of those optical illusions where you go, silly me, now I see it. If I go back to the original, simply that it's in our evolutionary interests for our minds to detect contrast rather than absolute levels. And in everything we do, we're calibrated to detect contrasts, hotter, colder, and actually that applies to price as well, by the way. It's all about more expensive, less expensive. We don't really have an internal measure of the hedon, as economists believe. Oh, that's pareidolia. This was an architect who thought if I add roundel windows to this church tower, it will be known as the beautiful church with the roundel windows. Was it? Heck, it's the chicken church. That's because it's hugely to our evolutionary advantage to be able to detect faces, and the facial recognition module or subroutine in our head gets triggered slightly too often. But it's probably better than the other way around, where I would be, if I had a very low tendency to see faces and things, I'd be going, what are these strange objects in seats? They're probably people, okay? Best example of pareidolia, by the way, confused washing machine, there you go. But even facial recognition software does this. Most of System 1 works through heuristics. We do not calculate quadratic equations when we catch a ball. We use the angle of gaze heuristic. We look up at the ball, see the angle of gaze, and move towards it at whatever speed keeps it constant. It's not perfect, but then the information we have isn't perfect. To solve quadratic equations, we need to know the velocity and angle at which the ball left the bat, okay? Now, first of all, the batsman himself doesn't know that, and even if he did, he's not going to tell you. He'd lie if you asked him, because why would he help you catch the ball? And we've evolved for a world where people give us imperfect information and unreliable information. Copying other people, I'll have what she's having, to those of you who know when Sally met Sally. Pretty reliable heuristic much of the time. Also vital to remember that we've evolved to satisfy, not to maximise. The idea of optimization is one that exists in mathematics but virtually never exists in the real world. What we want most of the time is something that's definitely pretty good, and it's almost certainly pretty good and definitely isn't terrible. That's why McDonald's is the biggest restaurant in the world, chain in the world, okay? Is it the best restaurant in town? No. What McDonald's is absolutely brilliant at is at not being shit. Okay? Now think about it. Okay, I asked people this question, just to prove this. What's the best restaurant meal you've ever had in your life? And they go, it was this little place 30 miles outside Perugia. It was back in 1993. You ask the second question, and how often have you eaten there? It's always the same answer, once. Okay? Whereas they've eaten in Pizza Express 50 times, right? Because most of the time what we want is something that's pretty good and definitely isn't terrible. Say what you like about McDonald's, the absence of badness is really quite impressive. We like, for evolutionary reasons, eating food that's identical to food we've eaten before. Makes sense, doesn't it? Because if I'm still alive to wonder about eating it again, it didn't kill me the last time. Ray Kroc said that people don't want the best burger in the world, they want a burger that's just like the one they had last time. And we just like that, okay? It's the way we're wired. I know it's unfashionable, but in fairness to McDonald's, I always say I've never been ripped off, I've never been beaten up, I've never been insulted, and most of all, I've never been ill. You know, I've been to Michelin-starred restaurants, spent the whole afternoon on the bog. Let's be fair about this. So here are just 5 things. I'll be very quick now. Here are 5 things, okay, which really matter to us because of our evolved psychology, but which you can't put on a spreadsheet. And the thing that most concerns me about economics is that actually these are the roads that are going to be closed down if reality increasingly obeys the faulty sat-nav model of economic thinking. And I'll be very quick. We like autonomy, we like choice. That's why wine's such a popular drink. We don't actually like it very much. We'd all prefer a gin and tonic, in my opinion, if given. But it comes in 2 colours. So you can have a social event and go around saying red or white, and you've given people placebo choice. You can have a drink you don't like very much, but you can choose what colour it is, okay? This is everywhere. Tea or coffee, still or sparkling. The single phrase still or sparkling makes restaurants millions of pounds a year because it makes it more difficult to say tap. Would you like water? Yes, tap. Still or sparkling? Ah, you got me, you bastard, okay? That's choice architecture, right? Now, you can design wonderful things. Halo, I think, understands that actually what really matters, what really makes it advantageous. Do you have that in Brighton yet? Any on, okay. It's the human hatred of uncertainty. You could always ring for a taxi, but the period between ringing for a taxi and the taxi arriving, you enter the twilight zone of mental torture. Is he here yet? They said 5 minutes. Why isn't he here? Maybe he's already left. What if he's parked round the corner? I'll just walk round and go and look in the rain, right? In this system, you go, oh, look, you can actually watch him approach after you've booked. You go, oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll have another pint, okay? It's a completely different mental thing, even though if you try and measure it on objective numerical things, call-out time, response time, availability, it's no different from ringing for a taxi. Psychologically, it's a different thing. And I think one of the things we need to understand really, really well and fast is the other things that contribute to a working economy, which economics just doesn't understand. Now, I haven't got time to talk about trust. Just to say that, for example, okay, brand preference is completely bonkers, isn't it? That we pay a premium for something from for someone with a brand reputation. No. If you understand satisficing, first of all, what we want is not the best product. The brand does not guarantee the product's really, really good. It's a fairly good guarantee that the product isn't rubbish. Why? Reputational game theory. Someone with a valuable reputation that's cost them millions of pounds to build up over 20 or 30 years stands to lose much more from selling a bad product than someone with no reputation at all, who can simply reinvent themselves under a new name next week, okay? Understanding how we instinctively, System 1 processes reputational game theoretic calculations. In other words, what has this person got to lose from selling me something bad? Suddenly, brand preference makes a lot of sense. Customer loyalty makes sense. In Brighton, how many people here always use the same taxi firm? How many people vary it? Interesting. And this is when you ring for one. Now, to an economist, that's sort of irrational, right? No. If you always use the same taxi firm, you can trust the taxi firm more. Why? Because you've now got a credible threat of defection. They might actually care about losing you as a customer. If you use 7 firms indiscriminately, you're basically worthless and they don't really care about losing you. Once you understand a bit of game theory and a bit of this stuff, an enormous amount of what seems really weird and irrational in the marketplace makes a lot of sense. Bank architecture, for example. Marble, lots of oak. What's that? It's basically, I need a reliable indicator, a costly signal in evolutionary terms, that when I deposit $20,000 with the bank, they're not going to up sticks. Upfront expense in an immovable asset, it's effectively a commitment device. The other interesting aspect of bank architecture, by the way, you made the banking hall really big. Do you know why? Because the worst thing that could happen in a bank is a queue stretching out onto the street. Because then the townspeople would assume there was a run on the bank and all join the queue. The trick is you had to make the banking hall big enough to keep the queue indoors so nobody else noticed it. But a lot of these things have an extraordinary amount of evolved intelligence. I haven't got any time for any more, but the study of the extraordinary instinctive ability to decide who to trust and who not to trust needs vastly more study. Because if all we understand is the mathematical bit, and as a result we neglect the bit that currently has no mathematical expression. And bear in mind that maths doesn't develop actually particularly evenly. Game theory, for example, only became, basically statistics and probability were total crap in maths until about 150 years ago, till Galton, I guess, okay? All right? Game theory only came about in about 1950. So the danger is that the pace of progress in maths determines what we think is important. And if we become increasingly reliant on computers to actually take away the responsibility for decisions, that's what's going to happen. Engagement ring, by the way, is also upfront expense as proof of long-term commitment. The reason women, by the way, particularly like being bought jewellery and flowers by men is precisely because men aren't remotely interested in jewellery and flowers. Therefore, it shows that you've actually made a sacrifice to make them happy with no suspicion that there's anything in it for you. By contrast, if you buy your girlfriend a radio-controlled helicopter for Christmas, there is a strong degree of suspected self-interest. So I'll end with simply that and say thank you very much indeed. That's a reading list. It's absolutely not exhaustive, but the Pareto principle applies. If you just read actually 20 or 30% of them, you'll learn 80% of the good stuff. Thank you very much indeed.